Good afternoon, friends, and welcome. My name is Nico Slate. I teach here at Carnegie Mellon in the History Department, and it is my great honor and privilege to welcome you all here to not one, but actually two separate performances by Anjal Chande. Here's how it's going to work. I'm going to offer a very brief introduction to the event and a slightly less brief, but hopefully not too long, introduction to the first piece. Anjal will then come out and perform that piece, after which we're going to have a very brief opportunity for questions from the audience. She wanted us to have interaction after each piece because they're both extremely rich, and she wants to have as much audience interaction and participation as possible. So on that front, if there is anyone towards the back that wants to come up towards the front, please feel free to do so. And as you're watching the performances, please think about how they're touching you, how they're moving you, what they're making you think about, because we will have opportunities after both performances for you to share your own thoughts and ideas and inspiration and questions. But first, I'd like to thank those who've made this opportunity possible. Richard Shyness, the Dean of the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences, Jen Keating, the Assistant Dean, and my colleagues Mariana Achugar and Rich Purcell. I'd also like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to offer a very personal thank you to our performer this evening, Anjal Chande. In the spring of 1941, in the midst of the Second World War, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay sat down in the whites-only section of a segregated train traveling across the American South. And just across the Louisiana border, the ticket collector ordered her to move. And she asked him why, and he said, "That is the rule, and you better obey it or else." She did not move. He went away and he studied her. After a little while, he realized she was not African American. He came back and he asked her, "Where are you from?" And she replied evasively. She said, "New York," which is where the train had been coming from. And he said, No, I mean, which land are you from?" Now, at this point, Kamaladevi could have said, "I'm a famous Indian dignitary, friends with Mahatma Gandhi. I just spoke to the United States Supreme Court, the United States Congress, and had tea with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm a big shot. You're obviously not. Get out of my face." That's what she could have told this belligerent ticket collector. But instead, Kamaladevi replied, "I am a colored woman, obviously, and I refuse to leave my seat." He muttered, "You are an Asian," but he did not bother her again. And in identifying herself as colored, Kamaladevi forged solidarity with the millions of African Americans who suffered those indignities on a day-to-day basis and were at that time often called colored. She also advanced a conception of transnational, transracial anti-solidarity that had been pioneered by the great African American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois. Many of you will be familiar with Du Bois, and you might know that he very famously called the problem of the 20th century the problem of the color line. But what many people overlook is the fact that Du Bois did not define the color line in terms of a dichotomy between white and black. Instead, he saw the world in terms of those who had power and privilege. In his day, most of them were white, and those who were oppressed, not just African Americans, but people of color, and that was a very important word for him, in the Americas, in Asia, and in Africa itself. And Du Bois envisioned a solidarity between people of color, he called them colored people, throughout the world. And Kamaladevi read Du Bois. She was influenced by him, as were many Indian figures, and when she defined herself as colored, what she did is owned his way of thinking about a transnational, transracial solidarity that crossed the borders, not just of nations, but also of races. Now, as I said, I'm a historian, and I wish I could say that that kind of transnational, transracial solidarity is only necessary in history. But sadly, in our world today, in a world in which racism, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination are resurgent, the need for those kinds of solidarities that cross borders of nation, of race, of gender, of sexuality, of every different form of identity, there's a huge need for those kinds of solidarities. And that's why when I look at these pieces, I don't just look at them as a historian, I don't just look at them as someone who loves the art form that you're about to see. I also look at them as the citizen of a world that is rapidly changing, and changing in ways, friends, frankly, that I find quite terrifying. And I'm going to end with just one example. I could give you, sadly, many, but one example that is especially relevant, I think, to the first performance you're about to see. And it's an example I expect some of you know of, but perhaps not all of you. Less than 3 months ago, an Indian man living in Kansas was shot and killed in a bar. He was shot and killed by a white man, a veteran of the United States Navy, who demanded first to know his visa status and yelled at him to get out of the country before shooting and killing him. Now, that Indian man, Srinivas Kuchibhotla, was in many ways emblematic of the best that Kamala Devi brought with her when she came to this country. He was someone who was crossing boundaries in his own life, and the man that shot him down was rejecting that kind of border crossing. Now, if he had acted alone, that would be the random act of a particular madman. But as many of you know, those kinds of hate crimes based on racism, but also on xenophobia, on a fear of immigrants, on a fear of anyone who's seen as different, those kinds of hate crimes are surging at a time when even our most powerful figures are more interested in building walls than breaking them down. That's why I think that the kinds of art that we're about to experience right now is so important, not just because it teaches something about history, but also because it teaches us something about the world we're in now, and the world that we, I think, personally, all have to fight to try to build. So without further ado, friends, I'm going to welcome Anjal for the first performance, after which there will be a brief opportunity for you all to share your ideas and questions, so please do think as you're watching. I will then very, very briefly introduce the second performance, and then there'll be another opportunity for Q&A. So without any further ado, friends, I am honored to introduce Out of the Shadows, A Colored Solidarity, an original work of Bharatanatyam, written, choreographed, and performed by Anjal Chande. Thank you.
Like the borders between nations, racial boundaries have been sites of contact and crossing. Also like national borders, racial divisions have been changed, invented, and erased. In the years between the First and Second World Wars, African Americans and Indians helped engineer one of the most creative and politically significant redefinitions of racial borders in the 20th century: the invention of the colored world. I am a colored woman. I am a confluence of identities. I live at the intersection of multiple oppressions. And so, I embody a resistance against all oppressors. And I forge a fellowship with my yellow, red, brown, black brothers and sisters. because we cannot relegate our struggles to the shadows. No, we will not relegate our struggles to the shadows. In the spring of 1941, in the midst of the Second World War, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay sat down in the whites-only section of a segregated train traveling through the American South. Just across the Louisiana border, the ticket collector ordered her to move. She asked him why, and the man said simply, "That is the rule, and you better obey it or you will regret it." She did not move. He walked away angrily but soon returned, subdued, it seemed, by something he had learned. He asked her where she was from, making it clear that he realized she was not an African American. "New York," she replied evasively. "I mean, which land do you hail from?" he clarified. At this point, she could have explained proudly that she was a distinguished visitor from India, a colleague of Mahatma Gandhi, a champion of Indian independence and the rights of Indian women. She could have listed her many distinguished American friends or told the belligerent ticket collector about her recent visit to the White House as a guest of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Instead, when prompted to tell the man from which land she came, Kamaladevi replied, "What difference does it make? I am a colored woman, obviously, and it is unnecessary for you to disturb me. This seat is just fine, and I have no intention of moving from here." The ticket collector muttered, "You are an Asian." But he did not bother her again. There is a binding quality in our suffering. There is a bridge between our struggles. There is an undeniable human need to realize our freedom dreams. By sitting, I point out injustice everywhere it exists. By sitting, I refuse cooperation with the exploitations that persist. By sitting, I stand in solidarity. I shall sit and and stand in solidarity. I shall sit and stand in solidarity. Our insular-peninsular outline has widened into the global, with an increasing awareness that we and the rest of the world are but part of a single sphere, that our destinies are inevitably linked, our paths interlocked. War, as much as peace, reveals that the world cannot be divided into islands of freedom and slavery, that the present system of one people holding another down by armed might, no matter with what smooth explanations, leads ultimately to world enslavement by fear and violence, and to colossal human, material, and moral destruction. Today, we witness the fantastic spectacle of big world powers claiming to fight for the larger freedom and greater happiness of mankind, feeling no sense of shame or humiliation in denying those very principles to millions of the people they still continue to exploit and dominate over. We and the rest of the world are but part of a single sphere. Our destinies are inevitably linked, our paths interlocked. We must sit and stand in solidarity.
I see a hand there.
First, I just want to thank you for a beautiful performance. I was wondering what kind of ties, if any, are there with classical Indian dance? Like, are there certain gestures that you have copied into or continued into your choreography?
Yes, first I just want to say thank you so much to Nico for having me here. It is quite an honor to have been working with you on this project. Nico kind of incorrectly introduced the first piece in that much of that text is actually Nico's writing in his book, Colored Cosmopolitanism. I wrote a small part of that, and then some of the words are also words of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay. So I wanted to, just so you know, if you haven't read his book, he is a storyteller. You're a storyteller, I feel like, naturally. But to answer your question, I describe my work as contemporary Bharatanatyam. In this particular piece, I would describe it as 100% Bharatanatyam in terms of its physical vocabulary. So I could describe every single hand gesture according to the classical organization of mudras, the movement, the tandavams, the positions in the legs are all actually really spot-on classical Bharatanatyam technique. I think it's mostly in the application and the exploration of what else is possible that my work starts to sort of move, and I don't want to necessarily say move away, but move and expand sort of what the art form can include.
Thank you. I see another hand.
I just wanted to ask a question about your collaboration. It seems that when you have an artist collaborating with a historian, that in some ways you change each other in terms of some ways of thinking. And I just thought if you could give us some ideas about how your thoughts have changed as a result of engaging with historical scholarship, and maybe Nico from your end, how as a historian you've been changed by collaborating with an artist, you know.
You want to go first?
I can start. Thank you for the question, Joe. I would say the first, maybe I should actually give a little bit of history to our collaboration perhaps first. So Angela and I were introduced by a curator at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington who invited us to create this joint piece for a cultural festival on the idea of intersectionality. And as all of my students are aware, and I expect many of you are, intersectionality is a way of thinking about how identities are not contained in little boxes, but overlap and intersect. So one's sense of oneself is not just based on race, but also on gender, on sexuality, on religion, on language, on nation, and these things overlap and intersect, and often oppressions do likewise, so that a black woman is oppressed not just based on her race, but also on her gender. It was a remarkable invitation for me because we historians don't get invited to do such collaborations very often, and I myself am often surprised when my work has meaning to those outside of the academy. I certainly want it to, and I certainly hope it will have that meaning, but I think perhaps it's part of what it means to be a scholar that you never really know who's going to read your history book. You know, you're not a best-selling novelist, and so you write something, you hope people read it, you never know if they will. And then to have someone as thoughtful and creative as Anjul read my work and transform it and really make it her own. I guess that's why I don't really see even the words in the performance as mine, because you really made them your own and you've taken them in such new directions. That's a tremendous blessing for me. And I think perhaps the number one thing I've taken from that is just to be, in some ways, even more humble about what my work can do, but at the same time be hopeful that all the little seeds that all of us plant in all of our lives, I think this is really a human phenomenon, right? We all do our thing every day, and we never really know what kind of ripples we're creating from our work. And Anjul's given me a tremendous boost in the sense of seeing how something I have done could have a meaning beyond even what I imagined it might hold.
I wanted to say that I think so much of my work more recently, and dance, I think dance naturally is very I had a feeling it was kind of sounding funny. Dance is very naturally a thing of the moment, right? It's ephemeral and transient, and I think a lot of what we strive to do is dance performers is to really embody the present moment and give fullest life and attention to that present moment. And I think that specifically to my work, I think in the last handful of years, I've been very interested in sharing present day stories. And I think, and yet, I very naturally have always loved history, and I've always loved the social sciences and humanities. And I think that what's been really nice is to kind of crawl back into history and bring those stories into the present moment and embody them. And not, certainly through dance and theater, that's an ongoing pursuit, right? We're always trying to tell a story, often of the past, if not of the present. But I think that diving into so much of the emotion and the power behind the stories that Nico has captured in his research has really kind of opened up my my love and my desire to further explore really those connections between past, present, future, and between history, politics, personal, etc. And so I think I take a lot of that inspiration from this project.
If I could add just one more thing before we go to the next question, I realize I should also say this is, some of you might not know, this is Joe Trotter, the director of CAUSE, the Center for African American Urban Studies, which also supported this performance and is, to my mind, the best embodiment in this institution, in Carnegie Mellon, of the kinds of links that Angela and I are talking about, links between the past and the present, between the academy and the world beyond. CAUSE is a really unique institutional entity in my mind in that it is both simultaneously of the university and far beyond it. So I think really in your own work, you're also embodying the kinds of linkages that we're trying to do here.
I'll keep it very brief, but one couldn't help but be reminded of Rosa Parks as well.
Certainly, I think, Nico, if you wanted to speak to this at all, but reading Nico's book, Colored Cosmopolitanism, shared story after story, activist after activist, who so many times embodied this kind of story that we just shared with you. And it was such an inspiration to see on both sides of the globe the kinds of stories that Nico had unearthed about individuals who were, known or unknown, taking the risk and putting themselves at the front of the line, at the front lines to push civil rights and human rights forward in one way or the other.
And I think one of our goals, at least I'll say for myself, one of my goals is to remind us all that we can also carry forward that legacy. I think one of the problems with history, as it's so often taught, is that we tend to think of everything moving through a few great individuals, right? The civil rights movement is Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. The Indian independence movement is Gandhi. But in fact, there are hundreds and thousands of incredibly courageous people who do remarkable things and are often forgotten. In this case, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay is not nearly as well known as she should be. Her protest in Louisiana happens 14 years before Rosa Parks. And even a year before that, in 1940, Pauli Murray, one of my personal heroes, a young African-American woman, sits down on a bus in Virginia and courts arrest in order to launch what she calls satyagraha. And that word is Gandhi's word for nonviolent civil disobedience, and she uses it very explicitly. So there's this long line of people who courageously stood up against injustice and learned from those across the globe, creating this whole network of resistance. And that network goes all the way up to the present day. It's still with us, right? There are amazing people in our world today who are just as courageous, just as creative as Rosa Parks. And we have to, I think, remember that and then take on the responsibility of carrying that legacy forward. Perhaps that's a good opportune moment to briefly introduce the next piece, and then we'll have a chance to talk again after that. So Angela asked me to frame the next piece briefly in terms of actually an experience that probably it looks like about half our audience knows quite intimately, and that is a new course that was offered this past semester. It was offered by myself, Professor Mariana Chugar, and Professor Rich Purcell, and it's a course on racism. It's one of several interdisciplinary freshman seminars here at Carnegie Mellon that aim to tackle major problems in our world. And the piece that Anjal will perform for us is called Race. It's a working title. And responds in her own way, through a very personal lens, to issues of race and racial identity. What struck me so much hearing about the piece, and I haven't actually seen it yet, so I'm very excited to see it with you all for the first time. What struck me hearing about the piece is that a reminder that race and racism take many forms in our world, and yet none of us are able to fully evade their influence. And I say that in part as a white male. I think it's very important to note that often white Americans in particular tend to think of race and racism as something that doesn't really touch them, which is kind of quite remarkable actually in some ways, and perpetuates the kinds of inequalities we face in this country. So when we think about, say, the fact that the city of Pittsburgh is so segregated on both racial and class lines, we can see that as an African American problem. You know, this is a problem African Americans have to deal with and they should struggle for, but in fact it's really all of our problems. And so for me, one of my goals for our racism course was that we had a quite diverse group of students and a diverse group of faculty, both in terms of our own backgrounds and our intellectual interests. And my hope is that we were able to explore, and you all students can tell us if we did it well enough, but we were able to explore the issue of race and the fact of racism in a way that shows us its diversity, the way it impacts us all in so many different ways, but also its universality. Even beyond this country, the way that the issues of racism and inequality, whether based on ethnic identity or language or religion or in India, caste, that those differences in some ways knit us all together and make us all responsible for doing something about it. As with the first piece, after the second performance, there will be a chance for Q&A as well. So keep your brains actively churning. Do you want to say anything more to introduce this?
I think your introduction was great. I think that this next piece is sort of a few chapters in what I think will be multiple chapters of work reflecting on race from kind of all the different angles that you can start poking at it. And I really, really would love to hear your response to it and hear what it stimulates in your own thought. I do think that, I just wanted to echo that one point of like, it is interesting and peculiar when you have an experience that feels cushioned and bubbled out and away from your overt day-to-day racism. And I think that that is something that I want to reflect on, and I want to see how we can more explicitly connect those dots for people who think that it's somebody else's problem, But yeah, I really invite your thoughts afterwards.
Freedom isn't free. And so who paid for my freedom to dance this dance? I don't know how to say thank you, and gratitude is an odd thing to offer people for the non-voluntary exploitation they suffered to make the particularities of my privileged existence possible. So maybe it's not that I thank you quite, but I remember you. I honor you, I pay my respects, I bow my head. I ask myself, how can I repay this debt to my ancestors? I can imagine your spirit. Your spirit enlivens me. I can imagine your courage. Your courage emboldens me. I can imagine your imagination of a more just and peaceful world. I must keep my imagination alive. I make an offering to the 10 million plus indigenous people who stewarded this beautiful bounty of Mother Earth, and to the 10 million plus Africans enslaved whose perseverance in tragic, undignified circumstances brought prosperity to our country's economy, and whose descendants later fought for equality and justice in our nation's law, and to the generations of immigrants who toiled as heroes, as hard workers, and as movers and shakers that uplifted us from what otherwise is our country's deplorable history and its shameful conscience to shape it into something somewhat better. And to my parents for their most immediate sacrifice. To all the bodies and souls who made it possible for something other than whiteness to live a normal, peaceful life on this stolen, but that's okay, land, I just want to say, I remember you. I live a normal, peaceful life, but I know it was not free. Racism. 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 What precedes race is racism. To fight our insecurities by exploiting others' vulnerabilities, to profit off of claiming superiority, to colonize, to oppress, to make money, to make a better name for oneself, to feel better. Is it so hard to feel okay about ourselves without putting someone else down? Is it so hard to prosper without standing in someone else's way? The obsessive bully behavior, gaslighting fervor, power-hoarding manner by which we insist on the lesser value of another human by picking pigment as an arbitrary way to divide us, is racism. Racism gave birth to race, and we need not acquiesce to this categorization. True emancipation, one day, will free us from this conceptual constraint. So there's this black-white race binary. I'm brown. I'll just sit this one out. It would be nice if being brown meant I lived in a raceless utopian bubble, that I was excluded from the American power struggles and prejudiced battles. But no, I still feel otherized. I just provide one more person to point to. When the going gets rough, when one oppression isn't enough, they turn to the next. In a society so conditioned to obsess over our differences and stoke the flames of fear of the unfamiliar, we all face racism. We all face exclusion. Yet within the not always applicable but certainly so pervasive black-white binary, I often have to operate. And in fact, in retrospect, I realize I have often benefited. Brown folks in America infer that we should strive to be white and not black, because it is made obvious that the latter have been relegated to the bottom of some peculiar ranking system. If we ever, knowingly or unknowingly, use this to get ahead, then we legitimize it. If we don't question it, then we condone. We may likely all be complicit. Complicit until we are aware. Complicit until we stand up and care. If we brown folks have ever contributed to the normalizing of white superiority, then we are part of the perpetuating problem. We actually cannot just sit this one out. Freedom isn't free. And so who paid for my freedom to dance this dance?
Perhaps I'll abuse my position and ask the first question this time, and then we'll open it up to the room as well. That was very powerful. Thank you. There were several parts that resonated with me, but I think that the line racism comes before race, that you said in a couple different ways, that idea and this motion that you had, it looked like you were grappling with something, struggle with something, your arms were moving. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that idea and that motion, and what they mean to you.
Sure. I think that the idea of racism precedes race. I'm curious if people disagree or how you guys converse about that in class. But I think I'm just, and I'm not insisting on seeing it in a certain way, but I think that it's really interesting to understand that this idea that when we feel that there is a need to be divisive and a need to push people apart, usually that need is the need for further enhancing our own success or whatever. When we find that need, then we do whatever it takes. And I think that this idea that people, humans, we have so much great, powerful, wonderful potential, and then we also have this other kind of potential to sort of stoop lower than we should. I think suggests that, it's quite likely that we human beings decided to invent things to kind of further our own causes, and this idea of how do we legitimize the way in which we categorize and split up everybody, and how do we create the terminology to tell the stories that we want to tell. So I think that that's part of what I'm reflecting on there. I'm sure there's probably so much more to say about that. The gestures, I think there may have been a couple moments, I think that sort of that first little chapter about reflecting on all of the sacrifices that had come before my, somewhat normal, loosely peaceful life. I think the angst, and someone had asked me about hand gestures. In Bharatanatyam, there's always these very specific hand gestures, and I think that I definitely wanted to sort of have this contracted, amorphous, difficult to articulate feeling, because it's difficult for me to feel how I need to feel, should feel, want to feel around that history, which is part of my history. I feel like it's part of all of our history to be here on this land, and yet it's just the difficulty of knowing how to feel about it and wanting to draw light to it, but also the yuckiness, the sorrow, the tragedy in it all. I feel like there's no clear way to convey that, and sometimes that sort of collapsed, fraught movement and that challenge, and even allowing the fingers and the hand gestures to fully kind of be okay, is maybe something that I wanted to capture.
Thank you. Questions or thoughts? There's one right in the middle there.
One thing that I really appreciated about your pieces was that there was less of an emphasis on the music with regard to choreography, and obviously in the second one there was no music, and it was based on the words. But I was wondering that as a Bharatanatyam dancer, in which in a religious context there is kind of you're following the music. I was wondering what that creative process was like for you in terms of choreography, things like that.
Do you feel like for both pieces, or more so the latter?
More so the latter, but it could be both as well.
Yeah. Bharatanatyam is kind of by default, we call it a dance form often, but it's really a dance theater form, right? So there is the nritta, right, which is just like the pure dance movement, and then there's the abhinaya, the facial expressions, the storytelling, the use of hand gestures to share literal stories. So saying that, I feel like, there is your question is what's the creative process like, right? There's so much to share. I think that theater, there's this interesting fluidity, I think, between dance and theater. And I think that some of my creative process is perhaps inspired by that fluidity, because, for example, I can explore it more in more of a literal theatrical way, where I say, you know, today we are suffering, for example, but you can also create your own gestures. And sometimes those gestures might be hand gestures, or they might be gestures of the whole body, which is then when it sort of steps over that line, perhaps, and that's maybe what many dancers think of. That's the way that dancers may think about their work. So when you're using gestures of the full body, you can be using that to explore, to apply your physical body to a theatrical sort of mode of choreography. I don't know if that makes sense. But I think that, yeah, music is also interesting. I mean, I think I've been starting to compose a lot of my own music, write a lot of my own text, and in the dance world, on the flip side, you know, there's so much to say about this. I should just cut myself off soon. But you know, in certain genres of dance, text and lyric don't matter much at all. In other genres of dance, like Bharatanatyam, lyrics do matter, although lyrics are very rarely in English. And I think I'm exploring my relationship between text and literal thought and meaning and poetry, as well as my relationship to those moments when language in that more traditional sense is not a part of it. So that's not a very direct answer to your question, but I think that these are all things that I'm exploring, and I can definitely speak longer about it, but maybe that gives you a little bit of a taste to the answer you're looking for.
Thank you. There's a hand all the way in the back, so.
Excuse me, thank you. Yes, I found a number of points in your work, you know, really thought-provoking, and I want to say thank you. One of the things that really struck me was your attention to sacrifice in, you know, being able to live a privileged life. And I kind of want to come back to that, but I was struck by that. You recognized this black-white binary that I think is actually really important and kind of is constraining in many ways for many people, including myself as a brown individual who was born in Malaysia but identifies as a Canadian citizen. Often in Pittsburgh, I find myself struggling with kind of how to explain to people where I'm from. But your point about not being able to sit it out was really powerful to me. And, you know, I'm kind of thinking about the, what was in the text, which was this observation that color seemed to be a rather arbitrary kind of way to separate people. But I guess in my understanding, I'm not totally sure it's arbitrary because of the history of slavery and how that contributed to the economy and even to our democratic institution. It seemed like there was very much a strategic kind of thought behind preserving this form of ill-gotten wealth that other people have talked about, but in a sense that color was very much you know, a conspicuous thing to separate out one group from another. And going back to your first play, you know, it was striking that the last thing that was said from the conductor was, well, you're Asian, and person walked off. And it seemed to me, connecting this back to sitting this one out, is that there is this kind of hierarchy of color that is enforced and that we may all be complicit in, because for many brown folk, we do have kind of this latitude to kind of move up and to kind of claim an Asianness that isn't quite whiteness but is not blackness, and that is something that reinforces this kind of binary and race privilege. So I guess connecting this back to witness, what you said earlier, and sacrifice, I wonder if there is some kind of sacrifice that maybe you think we might need to make. And you talked a little bit about kind of reparations earlier. I'm just kind of going all over the place, but I wondered if you can maybe speak to that, if a sacrifice is needed for the sacrifices that were made.
Yeah, I can speak, and I would love to have Nico speak too. Thanks for listening so carefully, and I appreciate the going all over the place. I feel like that's what my mind always does when I create these things. I guess, let's see, hopefully I can follow your train of thought with mine. I think the point of, which point to start on? The point of color being arbitrary, I think that in some contexts, we can appreciate it as arbitrary. I think that the general context of our world and the history that we have all now inherited kind of throws that out the window. So I guess I would say it's context specific, but I do think it's powerful to invoke the idealism or to just kind of fast rewind backwards so far if we can try to get our minds to appreciate a moment when maybe it could have been arbitrary. I also think that probably in smaller pockets around the world, maybe we can still see it that way. But I do think that the large history that we're inheriting is now one where we can't stop thinking about that. We have to address it. I think your point about sacrifice, I guess one thing that occurs to me, and I don't know how to do it quite, is that yes, if I'm able to have a somewhat peaceful existence, and I feel confident that I can trace it back to some degree, to a lot of people kind of paving the way for this bubble sort of existence of mine to exist. I do feel like, well, if others are not able to live this kind of peaceful life, one that is generally, free of fear and violence and hatred, like, what can I do to create that, right? And so I think that is something that I feel like, I guess I didn't say that so explicitly, but I do feel like I'm trying to follow that train of thought. You asked specifically about reparations and my feeling about that. I love the literature and the arguments for reparations, and I think that it's, for me personally, I think it's really, really hard to say no. I think that makes absolute sense. I think that there is something owed, and I think that maybe if we could get to a point where we can think that, okay, maybe there's got to be a way to implement something like this in our society. I'm sure we could get creative about how to do it, but that is my personal feeling on that. I understand that it's very complex to follow through, and we don't have politicians that are anywhere close to talking about it. But I would love to get your take on all of that. Yeah, interesting.
I also appreciated the range of ideas you brought together, so thank you for that. Maybe I'll just focus on this issue of the black-white binary and the very difficult choices it prevents for South Asians in this country, and has for a long time. As many of you know, when South Asians first started coming to the US in significant numbers just after the turn of the 20th century, in order to become a citizen, you had to prove that you were white. And many South Asians, around 60, 65, were able to successfully gain legal whiteness by convincing a judge that they were white, and that often entailed rolling up their shirt sleeves to have their underarms investigated, producing various genealogical documents, buying a spot in a whites-only cemetery, which I found quite a striking way to prove your whiteness. If you can get a spot in the cemetery, you're white. So there's many different ways that they're able to gain admission to whiteness, but at the same time, in the same historical moment, there are many Indian Americans who say, no, what we should be doing is rejecting the entire system that says that in order to gain the privileges of citizenship, one has to be white. one name that's long forgotten is Taraknath Das, who is a very important figure in the history of the Indian American civil rights movement, who fought for the rights of people of Indian descent in the US. And Taraknath Das very explicitly envisioned his struggle as a struggle against racism and inequality throughout the world. And if you bring that into our contemporary world, I think that same choice is there. Many of you are familiar with the idea of the model minority myth, which impacts, I think, not just South Asian Americans, but Asian Americans more generally. This idea that they can escape the burdens of race in this country by assimilating. In some ways that possibility exists, in some ways it doesn't, and as you said, it's very context specific. Srinivas Kuchibhotla, the Indian engineer who was killed that I mentioned earlier, was in some ways living the ideal model minority myth. He had a great job, he was living in a good community, and then one day it all ended. And I think in part because of that remarkable ambivalence and ambiguity, there is a calling, I think, for people of all backgrounds to stand up and fight against oppressions, even if they don't seem to impact them in one moment. And I'll just mention one person. I'm always curious. Raise your hand if you already know who Vanita Gupta is. Any of you news followers? Very few folks. Interesting. So Vanita Gupta was the assistant. Now I'm going to forget the exact title. The chief lawyer of this country. What do they call those people? Say again? The Attorney General, thank you. She was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights under President Obama. She is a very interesting case of an Indian American who decided to claim her brownness as a bridge to other people of color. And she gained fame when just after law school, she could have, many choices, she could have gone off and made lots of money. She decides instead to go to the small town in the middle of Texas and take up this case really single-handedly to prove that dozens of African American, predominantly men, had been convicted of drug charges in this very suspicious way by the testimony of one police officer who had been convicted of perjury before. And she was able to show that, in fact, many of these cases were fraudulent and got dozens of these innocent people out of jail in the process. They ended up making a movie about it in which she's played by Halle Berry, which I think is kind of interesting. Racial twist. But in any case, she then goes on to become, in some ways, one of our leading legal advocates for civil rights in this country, very much basing it on her own identity as a person of color. And she says that repeatedly. If you ask her, well, why are you're an Indian, attorney from famous law school, you could go out and do all these things. Why are you fighting for these poor black people in Texas? And she says, well, in part, it's because I'm a woman of color, and I feel this bond, I feel this connection. So I think there's still many examples today of people making the kind of choice that Kamala Devi made, saying, no, I'm not going to sit this one out, to use your very powerful phrase. I see a hand right in the middle there, and then actually there's two more too. We got a bunch of them. But yeah, right in the middle, and we'll come over there. Yeah.
So one of the problems that arises when discussing progressive issues is that oftentimes the people in the audience are people who've already bought into the importance of those issues. So in this case, I'm sure many of the people in the room already feel that racism, solidarity are important issues we should care about. But now in your work, you're combining a traditional art form with contemporary issues to discuss them. So I'm curious about whether you feel that has allowed you to open up to more audience members, bring them to the table who may not have been part of the conversation originally.
I think this always kind of pauses. You can hear me? I think that I have more work to do in terms of bringing it to greater audiences. I feel like one thing that has happened in the sharing of this work is, for example, people who are very familiar with Bharatanatyam. Politics and perspectives aside, maybe they're agreeable to all these ideas, but for people to witness Bharatanatyam, a classical form, being used and harnessed to explore these ideas, I think creates a sense of possibility for those viewers, not necessarily around ideas that they've never considered, but simply around the capacity they have to explore these ideas in the tools or in the forms of communication that they have at their disposal. And so I think that that's really powerful and really important. I think that as a teacher, I try to teach my students other stories and allow them to enact stories that are not their own, that are not necessarily from the Hindu mythology or Indian folklore, but rather, you know, stories of refugees or stories of plastic bag recyclers, etc., to allow them to see that this art form that is certainly profoundly rooted in a culture and should be appreciated for that can also be harnessed and explored in so many different ways to tell other stories that are important. So I think that that's a big part of it. I think that the other part of like getting different people in the audience to consider the ideas, I think that there's still more work to be done, for example, just among the South Asian population to get them in attendance to sit and witness this. I think that it's easier for them to appreciate you know, the dance form, the art form, maybe the innovation, but can people start to take these ideas back to their communities and feel like, you know, it's not just a story on the TV that I can listen, or a, you know, a movie that was very moving that made me cry that I can then forget about, but can it actually be something that is, again, we're not going to sit this one out, sort of, you know.
Thank you. I saw there are 2 other hands right here.
One thing I found really powerful was your use of silence throughout the piece, not just not absence of words, but also just silence in the movement. And I think that gave like a lot of space for me to think about my own, like how I have sort of like struggled with being in this binary racial conflict. So the piece had a lot of resonance for me because I grew up in a place where race really wasn't, it wasn't a conflict that was in my daily life, and I never witnessed it explicitly until I like moved from the Bay Area where I'm from. So I definitely found a lot of resonance in that. I have a question about a little bit more into your creative process. Like when you're writing the text, do you start with gestures that you want to impart, or do the words help you define the gestures?
I think that increasingly, I'm trying to, maybe there's like a really obvious exception that I'm forgetting, but it seems like I'm really enjoying words, and I'm really enjoying beginning a lot of my explorations by, you know, trying to tease out what it is that I'm feeling, you know, what it is that I'm feeling and thinking, and how can I articulate that, and then how can I convey that through words. And so a lot of my work recently has been actually driven by text. I feel like I'm forgetting like probably a really big thing that I just did that's the opposite, but you have to just give me a moment. It's not an absolute, you know, because I certainly will just get into a room and very often just move, oftentimes hum, and explore the emotions behind ideas that way. But yeah, text is becoming a very interesting part of the earlier side of my process.
I think we have time for just one last question, and there was a hand right there.
So, in your second piece, one of the topics was the race binary. I was just, this is a bit more personal, but I was wondering if you could sort of explain what your experience with it was like and how it's affected your work.
Yeah, I think that my experience with the black-white race binary, and with race in general, is one where I feel like at a younger age, it wasn't at the forefront of my mind. I was kind of carrying on, just focused on the cool things at school and the fun arts classes I was taking. And I think fast forward, I think one part of it that's challenging is wanting to be a part of a larger conversation. You know, as I started to engage more and more with just the humanities and social sciences and complexities of our world, and wanting to engage with it, and then yet somehow feeling like, oh, well, should my comment be coming from this perspective or that perspective, or am I allowed to identify in a certain way? And I think wanting to engage is what made me most self-aware of the fact that, like, I have choices to make, and I think that is a really interesting part of making art, is because you want to give a voice to, you want to give a voice to a lot of people, you want to give a voice to yourself. And I think, at least in my second piece, what I'm trying to do is not be an authority and tell you what is, regarding race or racism, but I'm trying to explore sort of the complexities of my own interaction with it, which I would just say is ongoing. It's ongoing in terms of how to identify and how to, what is your point of contact?
Maybe I can just add that I think it takes courage to bump up against those uncertainties and keep pushing. And so I'm honored to see you doing that in your work, and also in the time I've had to get to know you well. And it's something I'm personally inspired by, as I expect many of the folks are here as well. We all have those uncertainties and ambiguities in terms of who we are and what role we can play in confronting these issues in our world today. But that shouldn't stop us from trying. And I think you're an amazing role model of someone who keeps struggling to figure out where your place is and what role you can play. And so I thank you for that, Anjol. And please join me all, friends, in thanking Anjol for being here with us.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. It's always very powerful to have any audience be with me, be with us when we're up here on stage. And I'm around if you wanted to chat any more afterwards. But of course, huge round of applause for Nico for being so wholehearted and noble in his desire to bring all of these ideas to the surface through his history, through his research, through his classwork, his coursework, and through bringing me here. What little I can offer to his wonderful pursuits. So thank you, Nico, and thank you to the university.
Thank you.